The first lantern appeared on Clara Whitmore's porch on the 3rd of October, 1882, and she nearly shot the man who left it. She had heard the soft creak of the bottom porch step just past 10 o'clock at night, the sound of it cutting clean through the thin walls of her homestead cabin like a blade through muslin, and she had come to the door with her father's old Winchester already pressed against her shoulder, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her back teeth. But by the time she threw open the door and pressed herself into the cold Nevada air, there was nothing on the horizon except the dark, the stars, and the faint, retreating sound of hoofbeats swallowed by the high desert wind. And on the planks of her porch, set neatly beside the door as though it had always belonged there, was a lantern. A good one, too. Not some cheap tin affair with a cracked chimney, but a solid brass lantern with a clean wick already trimmed and a reservoir full of coal oil. It glowed steadily in the October wind, the flame inside it burning without a flicker, sheltered behind clean glass. Clara stood there in her nightgown and her boots, the Winchester lowering slowly as she stared at the thing. She looked out into the darkness one more time, saw nothing, heard nothing, and then she looked back down at the lantern. She had no idea what to make of it. She was not a woman who frightened easily, not after 2 years of running this property alone, but she was also not a woman given to ignoring things that did not make sense. She picked up the lantern, carried it inside, and set it on her kitchen table. She stared at it while she drank the last of her evening coffee, which had gone cold. Then she went to bed, slept poorly, and spent the better part of the next morning trying to decide if she had dreamed the whole thing. The lantern on the table told her she had not. Clara Whitmore was 24 years old, and she had lived alone on the 40 acres her father had left her for 22 months. Her father, Edmund Whitmore, had come west from Ohio in 1875 with enough money, enough stubbornness, and enough poor judgment about Nevada winters to establish a modest cattle operation on the scrubby flats south of Elko. He had done reasonably well with it, considering. He had built the cabin with his own hands, dug a good well, run a small herd, and made enough money from beef and occasional freighting contracts to keep himself and his daughter fed and clothed. Then, in the winter of 1880, Edmund Whitmore had ridden out in a January storm to check on a heifer he thought had gotten through the fence, and he had not come back. They found him 3 days later when the storm broke, his horse standing patient and frozen-breathed over him in the snow, Edmund himself having passed quietly of what the doctor in Elko said was almost certainly his heart. He was 51 years old. He had not been sick a day in his life, as far as Clara knew, which made it no easier to understand. Clara had buried him on the eastern edge of the property, under a juniper tree he had always liked, and then she had sat down at the kitchen table for 1 solid hour and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. After that hour was up, she had stood, washed her face, and gone back to work. There was no other choice available to her. She had no mother, no siblings, no relatives in the West, and the nearest thing she had to a neighbor was the Calloway Ranch a mile and a half to the north, run by old Tom Calloway, who was 67 and arthritic and barely managing his own place. She learned fast, and she was not afraid of hard work, and she had enough of her father's stubbornness to make up for several of the other things she lacked. She kept the herd small, 22 head of cattle and 4 horses, and she sold beef to the railroad camp at Carlin when she could, and to the general merchants in Elko when she could not. She mended her own fences, patched her own roof, hauled her own water when the pump needed attention, and shot her own rattlesnakes when they came into the yard in summer. She did all right. Not gloriously, not comfortably, but she did all right. What she did not do was accept company easily. There were men in Elko and the surrounding territory who had made their interest in her property, and occasionally in her person, quite plain, and she had made her position equally plain in return. She did not need a man to run her land, and she was not in the market for one. She said it plainly and without malice, and most of them accepted it, and the few who did not learn that Edmund Whitmore's daughter had inherited not only his stubbornness, but his accurate aim with a rifle. So the lantern was a puzzle. It was a puzzle she was still turning over in her mind 4 days later when the second one appeared. She was ready for it this time, or thought she was. She had taken to sitting up later, listening, though she could not have fully explained to herself why she was so certain it would happen again. But she was certain, and she was right. Just past 10 on the 7th of October, she heard the same soft creak of the bottom step, and this time she moved to the window instead of the door, pulling back the edge of the burlap curtain to look out before whoever it was could hear her moving. She saw a shape in the darkness. A man, clearly, tall in the saddle on a dark horse she could not make out clearly, and he was already turning away, already walking his horse south with the unhurried, easy motion of someone who had no intention of being caught. She pressed her face against the cold glass and tried to see more, but the night gave her nothing except his silhouette against the stars and the brief, dwindling sound of the horse's hooves on the hard ground. On the porch, another lantern. This one slightly different from the first, with a tin body and a green glass chimney that cast its light in a faint emerald wash across the gray planks, burning just as steadily as the first had. Clara opened the door and looked after the rider, but he was already gone. She brought the second lantern inside and set it beside the first on the kitchen table, and she sat down and looked at both of them for a long time, and she felt, alongside the reasonable suspicion that any sensible person would feel, the beginnings of something she did not quite have a name for, something that sat between curiosity and warmth. She did not like that she felt it. She pushed it aside and went to bed. By the second week of October, she had 4 lanterns on her table and a burning need to know who was leaving them. She had ridden into Elko on the 10th to sell 3 steers at the cattle pen and pick up supplies, and she had made what she considered a fairly subtle inquiry at the Garner Brothers General Store, where old Pete Garner knew more about the comings and goings of the county than anyone except possibly his wife. She had asked, as casually as she could manage while buying flour and coffee and a new bar of soap, whether Pete had heard of anyone in the area who might be in the habit of leaving lanterns on people's porches. Pete had looked at her over the tops of his spectacles for a moment with the expression of a man deciding whether something was his business, and then he said, "You asking about Rafe Callister?" She said she did not know. She was asking in general. Pete had said in his measured way that Rafe Callister had ridden into the territory about 2 months back and was working seasonal hire out at the Morrison Spread, which was 7 miles south and east of her property. He was a good hand, Pete said, from what Morrison had told him. Quiet type. Paid his bills on time when he came to town, which was not as common as it ought to be. Did not cause trouble. That was about all Pete knew. Clara had thanked him and bought her soap and driven her wagon home with her 400 pounds of supplies and a name sitting in her head like a stone in a shoe. Rafe Callister. She said it to herself once, driving home through the pale October afternoon with the scrubby sage flats spreading out on either side of the track and the Ruby Mountains going blue and cold on the horizon. She did not say it again. That night, the 5th lantern arrived. She heard the step creak and went to the window, and she saw him again, a little better this time because the moon was higher and brighter, enough to give her a clearer impression of a tall man on a dark bay horse, broad in the shoulders, wearing a coat that came to his thighs and a hat pulled low. He moved with the economy of someone who had spent a great deal of his life on horseback, no wasted motion, no hurry, just the smooth, confident movement of a man and a horse that understood each other perfectly. He was off the porch and turning south before she could make any decision about whether to speak. She opened her mouth anyway, leaning close to the window glass, but she did not call out. She watched him go instead. She picked up the 5th lantern from the porch and added it to the row on her kitchen table and stood there looking at all 5 of them for a good long time, their flames steady and warm in the dark kitchen, throwing long shadows up the log walls. 5 lanterns, 5 nights, no note, no explanation, no attempt at conversation. Whatever she expected from a man's attention, it was not this. She slept better that night than she had in weeks, which annoyed her considerably. By the third week of October, the row of lanterns had grown long enough that she had moved some of them off the kitchen table onto the windowsill and the shelf above the stove. She had not lit them all at once, choosing to burn only one or two at a time in the evenings, but she had kept every single one of them because throwing them away felt wrong in a way she could not articulate. They were well made, all of them, each one slightly different from the last as though chosen with some thought. One had a shade of red glass. One was made of copper gone green at the seams. One was simple and utilitarian and clearly the most practical of the bunch. She found herself thinking about the small decisions behind each choice. The way someone had stood in a store somewhere, or perhaps at a trader's wagon, and picked this particular lantern for this particular night. It struck her as a strange thing to do, also as an extraordinarily patient thing to do. She was a woman who respected patience. It was not common. On the 18th of October, she was mending a section of fence along the south pasture when she looked up and saw a rider on the low ridge to the east, sitting still against the gray sky. He was too far away to see clearly, but something about the set of him, the breadth of his shoulders against the horizon, the dark bay horse standing patient beneath him, made her think of her lantern man. She straightened and looked at him for a long moment. He did not move. Then a gust of wind came down off the ridge and she had to grab for the fence post wire she was holding before it snapped back on her, and when she looked up again the ridge was empty. She told herself it could have been anyone. Riders crossed the flats all the time. It meant nothing. But that night, the 16th lantern appeared on her porch, and there was something slightly different about it. It was a small lantern, more delicate than the others, with a ring of punched tin around the base making a pattern of tiny stars. Clara held it up in the doorway and turned it slowly, watching the pinpoint patterns of light it cast across the porch boards, and she felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been held tightly for a very long time loosening by one small degree. She set the star lantern on the table in the center of the row and went to bed and lay awake, listening to the wind. On the 20th of October, old Tom Calloway came by on his spotted mule, which he did perhaps once a month, to check on her and share whatever news had reached him from town. Tom had known her father for 10 years and had taken a grandfatherly interest in Clara that she allowed because he was genuinely kind and not at all troublesome about it. He was a weathered, slow-spoken man with knuckles swollen from the cold and eyes that missed very little. He sat at her kitchen table with his hat in his lap and drank the coffee she made him, and his eyes moved along the row of lanterns without any comment for a little while, which was Tom's way of gathering his thoughts. Then he said, "You've been collecting lanterns, Clara." She said she had come across some. Tom nodded slowly. "Rafe Callister," he said without any particular inflection. She looked at him. "You know him?" "Know of him," Tom said. "He come through Morrison's place. Good with horses, Bill Morrison says. Good with most things from what I hear. He was down in Arizona territory before this. Before that Texas, I think. Rode for a couple of outfits. Not the kind of man who stays in one place long, generally." He paused and turned his coffee cup in his gnarled hands. "Generally. What does that mean?" Clara said. Tom looked at her with his patient, grandmotherly eyes, which was the quality she appreciated most about him, that he did not seem to think the world required him to be anything other than an old man who had seen a great deal and had strong opinions about very little. "Just means generally," he said. "People change their generally sometimes." Clara said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Has he said anything to you about me?" Tom shook his head. "Seen him in town once. He bought a lantern at Garner's." He smiled faintly into his coffee. "Actually, I believe he bought two that day." Clara looked away, out the window at the October land, the grass gone yellow and dry, the sky white and enormous overhead. "He has never said a single word to me," she said, not precisely complaining, but not complaining either. "Some men don't lead with words," Tom said. He finished his coffee and put on his hat and went back to his mule, and he did not say anything else about it. But he was smiling when he rode away, and Clara stood in the doorway and watched him go and felt the whole situation settling around her like a weight she had not expected, but did not entirely want to put down. On the 23rd of October, after 21 lanterns and 21 nights, Clara made a decision. She had spent the morning at the serious work of the place, mending tack and checking the cattle for any sign of the respiratory ailment that had gone through a neighbor's herd the previous fall. She spent the afternoon splitting wood for the winter pile, which was not yet where it needed to be, and she worked with the particular furious efficiency of someone who is trying to exhaust a thought before it can fully form. She was not successful, because the thought was simple. She wanted to know him. She wanted to know the man who had spent 3 weeks leaving lanterns on her porch without once asking anything in return, without once making himself known, without once attempting to use his small acts of care as currency for something else. In her experience, which was limited but not unformed, men who paid attention to a woman generally expected something immediately visible in return. This man had not. He had come in the dark and gone in the dark and left her nothing but light. She wanted to know why. That evening she did something she had not done since her father died. She put on her good dress, the blue one with the white collar that she normally reserved for Elko trips that mattered, and she brushed her hair until it shone, dark brown and thick, and she coiled it neatly at the back of her neck. She was not dressing for him. She told herself that quite firmly. She was dressing because a person ought to look decent when they intended to have a meaningful conversation. It was a matter of respect for the conversation. She sat by the window as the evening came down, reading by the light of one of his lanterns, which she had set on the table beside her chair, and the warm light of it fell across the pages of her book and across her hands, and she thought, against her will, and with a frankness she generally kept firmly behind locked doors inside herself, that she had been very lonely for a long time. At 10 minutes past 10 o'clock, she heard the creak. She was out the door before the sound had finished, moving fast and quiet in her boots, and she came around the edge of the doorframe just in time to see him crouching at the porch, setting the lantern down with a care that struck her even in that suspended electric moment. He was straightening, turning back toward his horse when she spoke. "Why?" she said. He went still. It was the complete stillness of a man who had been caught doing something private, who had calculated against this very moment and found the calculation had failed him. There was a long pause, long enough that the wind moved between them and the horse tossed its head once and settled. Then he turned around. In the lamplight from the doorway and the light of the lantern he had just set down, she got her first real look at him. He was perhaps 28, possibly 30, with a face that had been weathered by a great deal of outdoor living but not yet hardened by it, a strong jaw, dark eyes that caught the light in a way that made her think of river water, deep and moving. He was as tall as she had guessed from his silhouette, and he held his hat in his hand now, having taken it off automatically, which she noticed because it was an instinctive courtesy, and those were the truest kind. He looked at her for a moment, and she saw in his expression something she had not expected. Not guilt exactly, and not the cocky assurance of a man who thought he was charming. What she saw was something closer to openness, a kind of quiet honesty that sat on his face like a man who had made peace with being seen. "Because," he said, and then he stopped and started again. "Your place goes dark early, every night. By 8 o'clock there is no light in the windows." He paused. "That is a dark that comes from being alone, Miss Whitmore, not from being tired." She stared at him. Whatever she had expected him to say, it was not that. "You know my name," she said. "I asked Pete Garner," he said. "I know it is not much of an introduction. My name is Rafe Callister. I work for Bill Morrison. I am aware that you do not know me and that I have no right to be leaving things on your property without your permission." He glanced down at the lantern at her feet, then back up at her. "I apologize for that if it frightened you." "It did not frighten me," she said, which was almost entirely true. He nodded once, accepting that. She looked at him for another moment. The October night was cold around them, the stars sharp and closed the way they got this time of year in Nevada, and the lantern on the porch threw its warm circle of gold between them. She thought about all 22 of the lanterns inside her cabin, lined up on her table and her windowsill and her shelf, and she thought about what it meant that he had noticed her dark windows from however far away he had been riding when he noticed them. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" she said. Something shifted in his expression, something careful and pleased at once, and he said, "I would, Miss Whitmore, thank you." He tied his horse to the porch rail and followed her inside, and he stopped just inside the doorway when he saw the lanterns. She watched him look at them, all 22 of them arranged along the table and the windowsill, and she watched his face go through something she could not quite catalog, surprise and something softer, as he understood that she had kept every single one. He did not say anything about it. He sat where she directed him at the table, and she made coffee on the stove, and they talked. They talked for 2 hours. She had expected it to be awkward, because almost everything was awkward at first when you had been alone for a long time, when your conversational muscles had gone somewhat stiff from disuse. But it was not awkward. It was the opposite of awkward, which she did not have a word for, but which felt like two pieces of something fitting together without effort. He told her about himself with the same lack of performance that she had sensed in him from the beginning. He had grown up in Texas, he said, East Texas near the Louisiana line, the son of a cattleman who had lost nearly everything in the years after the war and spent the remainder of his life in a slow, determined effort to get it back. Rafe had worked cattle from the time he was 12 years old, had hired out to various outfits across Texas and New Mexico and Arizona territory in the years since, following the work where it went. He had come north to Nevada looking for something different, though he was not entirely certain he could say what. She noticed that he spoke about hard things directly, without the flinching quality some people had when they talked about difficult histories, but also without the excessive toughness of a man who needed you to know he was unaffected. He was simply a person who had experienced his life and was willing to talk about it, and she found that she trusted the quality of his account in a way that was instinctive and not entirely rational. She told him about her father, and about the 22 months, and about the cattle and the fences and the well that needed new rope on the pump handle every spring because of the minerals in the water. She told him about the wolf that had taken one of her calves in March, and the fence she had rebuilt herself in August after the posts on the south end rotted through, and the way the winters came down off the Ruby Mountains like something biblical, cold and precise and enormous. He listened the way very few people listened, which was with his entire attention, not saving any of it for thinking about what he was going to say next. By the time the coffee was gone, something had been established between them that Clara could not name and did not try to. She simply knew, with the quiet certainty that she applied to most things in her life, that this man was not a threat to her, that he was, in fact, one of the more interesting people she had encountered in a long time. "You could come back," she said when he stood to leave, "in the daylight if you wanted to." He put his hat on slowly, and the careful pleasure was back in his expression. "I would like that very much," he said. He came back 2 days later on a Saturday, riding up to the house in the mid-morning with his hat pushed back on his head, and a bundle tied behind his saddle that turned out to be a replacement pump handle, already cut to length, which he had made at Morrison's workshop. He did not make a declaration about it. He just held it up as he dismounted and said he had noticed in passing that her current one looked as though it might be getting close to needing replacement, and since he had the wood and the time. Clara looked at him and at the pump handle and said, "In passing from 1.5 miles away, you noticed my pump handle needed replacing." He had the decency to look slightly abashed. "I might have ridden closer than 1.5 miles a few times," he said. She took the pump handle and replaced the old one herself while he watched, because she wanted him to understand from the beginning that she did not require his hands on her property, only his company. When she was done, She washed the grease off her hands and they sat on the porch in the October sun, and she learned that he could be funny when he decided to be, in a dry, understated way that she appreciated more than broad humor. She learned that he had read more books than she might have expected of a traveling ranch hand, having made it a habit of carrying one in his saddlebag, trading finished ones at whatever general store he came to. She learned that he was good with horses in the deep way of someone for whom horses were not a tool, but a form of conversation. He came back the following Thursday and helped her set the 2 fence posts that she had been putting off because they required digging through caliche hardpan, and she had not had quite enough motivation to begin them alone. He worked steadily beside her without any of the performative effort that some men put into physical labor when there was a woman watching. No grunting or showing off. Just the clean, economical movement of a man who had done hard physical work for most of his life and was comfortable with it. When they were done, he leaned on the fence post and looked out over her south pasture, and she stood beside him and looked with him, and the afternoon light fell gold and long across the dry grass, and the distant mountains went purple in the early dusk, and Clara thought that this was what she had been missing without knowing she was missing it. Not help, exactly. Not even company, exactly. The particular ease of being beside someone who did not require anything of you in that moment except your presence. "You are planning to stay the winter at Morrison's," she said. He glanced at her sideways. "That is what I am hired for," he said. "Yes." After winter, a pause. The wind moved the dry grass in slow, comfortable waves. "I have not decided," he said. "There is more to weigh than I thought when I arrived." She did not ask him to clarify, and he did not. But the warmth of the implication settled around her, and she carried it back to the house with her when they parted, and it kept her company through the evening in the way that very few things had managed since her father died. November came in hard and cold, the way Nevada Novembers generally did, the first real snow arriving on the 7th in a driving wall of white that came out of the north and covered everything in 4 inches of wet, heavy ice by morning. Clara spent the day before it arrived getting her cattle into the winter pasture closer to the barn, and packing the gaps in the barn walls with old rags and dried grass, and she was just finishing the last of it as the sky turned the particular greenish-gray that meant the storm was close, when she heard the horse coming. He arrived at full dark, Rafe Callister on his bay horse in the front edge of the storm, having ridden the 7 miles from Morrison's to check. He said that she had everything she needed before the weather came down. She stood in the barn doorway looking at him arriving out of the dark, snow already beginning to fall sideways across the lantern light, and she felt something very clear and very strong in her chest, something that did not require analysis, only recognition. "I have everything I need," she said. "You did not have to ride out in this." "I know," he said. "Get your horse out of the weather," she said. "There is room in the barn." He unsaddled the bay and bedded it down in the empty stall beside her draft horse, and they spent an hour in the warm, hay-smelling dark of the barn, making sure all 4 of her horses were comfortable, and her cattle were settled, moving around each other in the small space with the ease of people who had already established an understanding of each other's movements. At some point, she handed him a spare horse blanket to fold against the cold, and their fingers met over it, and neither of them moved for a moment longer than was necessary. She made him dinner, which he had not asked for, and they sat at her kitchen table with the lanterns burning and the storm growing enormous outside the walls, and the snow drove against the windows with a sound like thrown sand, and the cabin was warm and smelled of coffee, and the rabbit stew she had made, and the pine resin from the logs. She thought, sitting there with her hands wrapped around her cup and him across the table with his long fingers doing the same, that she could not remember the last time her cabin had felt like this. Like a place where 2 people lived. He slept in the barn, which was where she had directed him, and he did not argue the point. In the morning the snow had stopped and left 1.5 feet of white silence on the world, and she looked out the window at it, and then at the barn where a thin line of smoke was coming from the small iron stove she kept there, and she felt the particular tightness in her chest of someone who knows they are in the early stages of falling in love and is not sure whether to be glad or afraid. She decided in the honest, direct way she generally decided things, that she was both. Through November they found a rhythm. He came twice a week when the weather allowed, sometimes to help with work, sometimes just to sit on the porch when it was warm enough, or at the kitchen table when it was not. He brought books sometimes, trading her his finished ones for hers, and they talked about what they read with the easy, pleasurable disagreement of two people who thought differently enough to make conversation interesting, but not so differently that conversation became frustrating. He brought her news from Morrison's, and from what travelers had told him, because the Morrison place was on the main south route and saw more traffic than her isolated 40 acres. She told him things she had not told anyone, about the loneliness of the first year after her father, about the nights when the wind made the cabin creak and shift around her, and the dark felt very heavy, and she had to forcibly remind herself that she was capable, and that capable was enough. She told him about the particular quality of grief that came with losing the last person who had known you your whole life, the way it left you feeling somehow less defined, as though a mirror you had not known you needed had been taken away. He listened to all of it with the same quality of attention she had noticed from the beginning, the full kind, and then he said, "You are one of the most defined people I have ever met, Clara. Nothing about you requires a mirror." He had started using her name somewhere in October, and she had not corrected him, and she was glad now that she had not. He said it in a straightforward way, as though it were simply her name and not an intimacy, which somehow made it more intimate rather than less. She said, "You are biased." He said, "I am starting to be. I admit that freely." She looked at him across the table, and the lantern light was warm between them and the November wind was building outside, and she thought, with the clarity of someone who has arrived at a decision, that she was done being afraid of this. "Rafe," she said, "yes. I am glad you started leaving lanterns." He was quiet for a moment, the good kind of quiet. "So am I," he said. December came, and with it the full severity of a Nevada winter which was not for the faint of heart. The snow piled itself against the north sides of every structure on the property, and the temperatures dropped to things that froze water in a bucket inside the barn, and Clara spent her days in a constant, necessary rhythm of chopping and carrying and checking and mending against the cold. Morrison's was a harder ride in December, and Rafe made it when he could, and when he could not he sent notes with the occasional traveler passing near her track, notes that were practical on the surface, checking on the cattle, asking about the well, but which had a quality underneath the practicality that she read with great pleasure. He was not a flowery writer. He was precise and clear, the way he was in person, but precision and clarity she had come to understand were his forms of tenderness. On the 15th of December, she rode into Elko for the last time before the deep winter made the road difficult, and she went to Pete Garner's store and bought coffee and sugar and salt, and a sack of dried beans and a bolt of flannel. And on impulse, she also bought a small book of verse that she had noticed on the shelf the last time she had been in, a collection of Elizabeth Barrett Browning that she had read parts of in her father's library, and that she thought Rafe might not have encountered. She wrapped it in brown paper and tied it with a piece of string and put it in her coat pocket. On the way home she passed the Morrison Road, which branched south off the main Elko track, and she turned down it without letting herself think too hard about the decision. Morrison's was a larger operation than her 40 acres, a proper ranch with a main house, 2 bunkhouses, a cookhouse, and a string of 8 outbuildings including a substantial barn. Bill Morrison himself was a thick, good-natured man of about 50 who met her in the yard when she rode in, clearly surprised but not unwelcoming, and told her Rafe was in the far barn working on a horse that had pulled up lame. She found him there in the warm, horse-smelling dark of the big barn, crouched beside a chestnut mare whose right foreleg he was examining with careful hands, speaking to the horse quietly as he worked. He did not hear Clara come in over the wind, and she stood for a moment in the doorway watching him, watching the way he handled the horse with absolute attention and a gentleness that was entirely unself-conscious. He pressed gently along the tendon and spoke to the mare in a low voice that Clara could not make out, and the mare, who looked like the kind of horse that did not suffer fools, stood patient and trusting under his hands. She must have made some sound because he looked up, and the thing that happened to his face when he recognized her was something she wanted to hold in her hands like a coal in winter, pure and warming. "Clara," he said, straightening. "I was in town," she said. "I brought you something." She crossed the barn and held out the wrapped book, and he took it from her hands, and when their fingers met this time, neither of them moved away. He looked down at the package in his hand and then at her, and the barn was warm and smelled of horses and hay and something of wood smoke from the small stove in the corner, and outside the December wind howled and pushed at the walls, but inside it was very still. "You rode out of your way," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he set the book down carefully on the ledge beside him, and he said, "Clara," in a way that had a great deal more in it than her name. "I know," she said. He stepped toward her slowly, giving her all the time in the world to step back if she wanted to, and when she did not, he put his hand against her face, his rough, warm hand against her cold cheek, and she leaned into it without deciding to. He kissed her with a careful deliberateness that she understood was his character made physical, the same attention he gave to everything, unhurried and entirely present, and she kissed him back with every month of kept lanterns and careful notes, and two people learning each other slowly, and with great seriousness. When they broke apart, the chestnut mare regarded them both with the profound disinterest of a horse who had more important concerns. "I have been thinking about staying," he said, "past spring." "I know," she said again. She realized, smiling. It had been a while since she had smiled without thinking about it first. "I have been thinking about that too." He picked up the book and unwrapped it there in the barn, and he read the title on the cover and looked at her with the quiet, pleased expression she had come to recognize as his version of delight, and he said, "I have not read this one." "I know," she said. "That is why I brought it." He rode back with her, and the December sky was the pale iron color of winter, and the snow lay in windswept sheets across the flats, and the Ruby Mountains disappeared into low clouds somewhere to the west. They rode side by side through the cold and talked and did not talk, and both things were equally comfortable, which she had learned was one of the truer measures of belonging. Christmas came and went quietly. She spent it alone in the cabin, but he had ridden out the day before with a small package tied behind his saddle, and inside it was a lantern, the finest yet, with a brass body and etched glass panels that made the light inside it into something like lace when it burned. She had held it up and looked through the etched glass, and the light had scattered across her hands in patterns of leaves and flowers, and she had felt the full, clear weight of being genuinely cared for. She had given him a pair of gloves she had spent 3 evenings making, good thick leather ones lined with wool, because she had noticed that the pair he wore had a split along one seam that he had not repaired. He had put them on and flexed his fingers in them with a look of such straightforward pleasure that she had to turn away slightly to keep her expression from giving away too much. January settled over the territory like a heavy blanket, dark and cold and persistent, and Morrison's became difficult to reach in all but the best weather. But letters came when travelers passed, and one evening old Tom Calloway arrived on his spotted mule, looking as though he had ridden through the entire winter personally, and on purpose to deliver a letter that had apparently arrived for her at Morrison's and been passed along the chain of travelers and neighbors until it reached him. The letter was from Rafe, which Tom clearly already knew from the expression on his face, and it was 3 pages long, which was considerably longer than his usual notes. She read it by lantern light at the kitchen table while Tom drank his coffee and did not ask any questions, which was one of his finest qualities. Rafe had written about the winter and the horses, and about a book he had finished, and about things he observed from the bunkhouse window in the evenings. Small, precise descriptions of light and sky and landscape that were so accurate she could see them as clearly as if she had been there. And at the end of the third page he had written, "I find that I am thinking, more concretely than I have permitted myself to think until now, about what I would like the next year to look like. If you have thoughts on that subject, I would be glad to know them." She wrote back the next day and sent the letter with Tom, who was going past Morrison's Road on his way into Elko in 2 days' time. She wrote 3 pages of her own, practical and honest as she always was, about the winter and the cattle and the book she was reading, and at the end she wrote, "As for the next year, I think about it a great deal. I think about it most in the evenings when the cabin is quiet and the lanterns are lit. I think you should come in the spring and tell me what you are thinking, out loud, where I can hear it properly." February passed. March arrived with mud and the smell of cold water running under ice that was still thick in the low places, and the Ruby Mountains shed their snow in long, slow avalanches that she could hear at night like distant thunder, and her cattle were restless and thin from the winter, and she spent long days out among them checking for condition and the early signs of the respiratory trouble she always worried about in spring. On a morning in the last week of March, she was at the water trough breaking the thin ice that had formed overnight when she heard horses coming up the track from the south, and she straightened and shaded her eyes and saw 2 riders, one of them on the dark bay she knew as well as her own animals now. He rode up and stopped and swung down from the saddle, and the other rider, a young man she did not recognize who was clearly coming from Morrison's on some other errand, lifted his hat to her and kept riding north toward Elko. Rafe stood in the March mud of her yard and looked at her for a moment, and then he reached into his coat pocket and brought out a piece of paper, folded twice. "I wrote it down," he said, "what I want to say, because I did not want to lose any of it." She pulled off her work gloves and took the paper from him and unfolded it, and she stood in the thin March sunlight and read it. It was not long. It was precise and honest, and it was entirely him, and what it said, stripped of everything else, was that he loved her, that he had loved her since October and perhaps before he fully knew her name, and that he wanted to stay. Not just through the spring, but properly stay. He was not a man of great property or fine prospects, he said, but he was a man who knew how to work and who intended to do it, and he had found in the months of coming to her land and sitting at her table that he did not want to be anywhere else. She read it once and then she looked up at him. "You want to stay on this land," she said. "I want to stay with you," he said. "This land comes with that which suits me very well." She looked at him standing in her muddy yard in his good coat and his second-best hat, with the March wind ruffling the brim, and she thought about 22 lanterns and a winter's worth of letters, and the way he had stood in Morrison's barn with a lame mare, and never once tried to be something other than exactly what he was. "Then stay," she said. He was across the yard in 3 steps, and she was in his arms, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because there was nothing left that needed to be said. He went back to Morrison's that afternoon to give his proper notice, because that was the kind of man he was, and Bill Morrison apparently shook his hand and said he had seen it coming since November, which everyone in the county seemed to have seen, except the 2 people most directly involved. By April, Rafe Callister had moved his saddle and his saddlebags and his considerable collection of traded paperback books into Clara Whitmore's cabin, and he was sleeping in the barn, which was where she had directed him, with the perfectly clear implication that this arrangement was temporary while they did things in the proper order. They were married in Elko on the 14th of April, 1883, in the small Baptist church on the main street that served most of the county's non-Catholic population. Tom Calloway stood up for the groom, looking enormously pleased with himself, and Pete Garner's wife stood up for the bride, which Clara had asked her because she was one of the few women in the territory who had been consistently kind to her without any ulterior motive that Clara could detect. The preacher was a young man from Ohio who had not entirely acclimatized to Nevada yet and kept pulling at his collar. The ceremony was short. Clara wore the blue dress with the white collar, and her hair pinned up with the 2 ivory combs that had been her mother's, which she brought out for very significant occasions. Rafe wore the good dark coat he had clearly had pressed by someone with an actual iron, and his hat was in Tom's hands during the ceremony. And when the preacher told him he could kiss his bride, he did so with a deliberateness that made Pete Garner's wife make a small sound of approval. They drove back to the ranch in the afternoon in Clara's wagon, with Rafe's bay tied at the back, and the spring was breaking across the flats in every direction, the sage going silver green and the first patches of wildflower coming up in the draws, yellow and purple against the red soil. The air smelled of rain that had fallen 2 days ago and the warm mineral smell of the land drying, and Clara sat beside her husband on the wagon bench with his shoulder against hers and the reins in her hands, because she drove her own wagon, and he sat beside her with his arm around her back and did not offer to take the reins. She loved him for that, specifically and precisely in that moment. They worked the ranch through the spring and summer as partners, which was the word she had always used and which now had a different, richer weight to it. He was extraordinary with the horses, which she had known, and it gave her an idea. She brought it up one evening in June when they were sitting on the porch after dinner, the summer air soft and smelling of sage, the stars coming out over the mountains in the slow, gorgeous way they did in Nevada. She said, "Morrison's cattle operation is not the best use of you." He glanced at her sideways. "No, you have a gift with horses," she said, "a real one. Morrison's horses are well enough, but what you are doing with mine in the last 2 months is remarkable." One of her mares, a difficult gray named Patience who had been near unrideable when her father bought her, was now, under Rafe's slow and patient handling, reliable under saddle and manageable at the lead. There are men in the territory who would pay good money to have a horse handled properly. "Breaking horses," he said. "Not breaking," she said. "You do not break them. That is the point." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the summer evening. "That would take time to build," he said. "We could not rely on it this year." "We do not need to," she said. "The cattle cover this year. We build it for next year." He turned and looked at her in the last light, and she saw in his expression the particular quality she had come to recognize as his response to her that he had never quite articulated but that she understood completely. A kind of profound, uncomplicated gratitude for exactly who she was. Not a version of her that required softening or adjustment. Just her. "All right," he said. By the following spring, word had gotten out among the ranchers and cavalry posts in northeastern Nevada that Callister at the Whitmore place could work with a difficult horse in ways that other methods had failed, and the work began to come in steadily. He built a proper round pen on the south side of the barn, working in the evenings after the regular ranch work was done, and she helped him set the posts because that was the kind of marriage they had, and when it was finished she stood in the center of it and turned slowly and said it was a good pen. He said it was a good partnership. In the summer of 1883, Clara discovered she was expecting, which she had hoped for and not assumed, and she told Rafe on a Thursday evening at the kitchen table over dinner in a straightforward way that was entirely consistent with how she handled everything. And he put down his fork and looked at her for a long moment with an expression of such complete, undisguised happiness that it made her eyes sting unexpectedly. He got up from his chair and came around the table and crouched beside her chair and took both her hands in his, and he said, "Are you well? How are you feeling?" She said she was feeling fine, which was true, and that she would continue to feel fine throughout, which was also largely true, except for 6 weeks of severe morning sickness in her first trimester that she endured with a grim efficiency that impressed even her husband, who was not easily impressed by toughness. Their son was born in February of 1884, delivered by the Elko doctor who had also attended her father's death, and who was considerably more useful in the former capacity than the latter. The birth was long but without serious complication, and at the end of it Clara held a 7-pound boy with black hair and dark eyes that would, in time, prove to be very like his father's, and she felt a large and uncomplicated love for him settle over her like a second skin. They named him Edmund Rafe Callister, Edmund for her father and Rafe for his own father, in a practical doubling that satisfied them both. Tom Calloway came to see the baby within a week of his arrival, looking entirely too pleased with the whole situation, and held the child with the practiced ease of a man who had handled a great many babies in his long life, and told Clara she had done well, which she agreed with. The years that followed were built on the twin foundations of hard work and the particular deep ease that comes from being, in the truest sense, home. They added to the cattle herd gradually, as the horsework grew and the income evened out. They rebuilt the south wall of the barn in the winter of 1885, working together on the cold days when the cattle required little attention, their breath making clouds in the air and their voices echoing in the new wood smell. They argued sometimes because they were two people with strong opinions and a shared space, but they argued cleanly and without cruelty, in the direct way of people who trusted each other enough to disagree honestly, and they always resolved things before they went to bed, which was a rule Clara had established and that Rafe accepted without reservation. In the spring of 1886, their second child arrived. Another boy, this one red-faced and vocally furious about the indignity of being born, 7 pounds and 2 ounces, whom they named James Morrison Callister, Morrison for Bill Morrison, who had, in a roundabout way, been the reason they had met. Bill Morrison had died the previous year of a fever that took him in 3 days, and they had gone to the funeral and stood at the graveside, and Rafe had stood with his hand on Clara's back, and she had thought about how a man she had never spoken to had set a train of events in motion by giving Rafe Callister a seasonal hire and a bunkhouse bed a mile from her property. Little Eddie, as he was called to distinguish him from his grandfather in conversation, turned out to be very like his mother, serious, capable, practical, with a gift for observation that Clara recognized in him early and cultivated with some deliberateness. James, called Jamie, was very like his father, patient and deliberate and good with living things in a way that went beyond instruction. Both of them grew up in the way of ranch children, knowing the names of plants and the habits of cattle and the weight of a post-hole digger, and the particular satisfaction of a fence that did not need mending twice. In the summer of 1887, the Callisters found themselves in the middle of a difficult situation that had been building in the territory for several years. The slow, grinding conflict between small ranchers like themselves and the large cattle outfits backed by Eastern money that were moving into Nevada and buying up grazing rights and water sources in ways that left smaller operations increasingly pinched. Clara had seen it happening on the edges of their county for 2 years, the gradual pressure of it like the weather coming in from the north, and she had talked to Rafe about it with the same directness she applied to everything. They had joined forces with the other small ranchers in the area, Tom Calloway and 3 or 4 other operations, to present a collective case to the county commissioners regarding water access and grazing rights on the public land that the large outfits were attempting to monopolize. It was not a violent struggle, but it was a real one, attended by hard words at county meetings and at least one incident in which a Morrison Creek fence line was moved in the night in a way that was clearly deliberate and clearly illegal. Rafe handled the situation with the same quality he brought to difficult horses. Not with aggression, but with a patient, persistent pressure that gave nothing and gave up nothing, attending every county meeting, speaking with a precision and a quiet authority that Clara watched from beside him and felt a profound pride in, the kind that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with recognition. They won their water rights, ultimately, not through any dramatic confrontation, but through the slow accumulation of documented evidence and the persistence of showing up, meeting after meeting, with clear language and calm faces. Tom Calloway said afterward that it was the first time he had ever won anything with patience, and that he had lived long enough to be surprised. The autumn of 1887 brought another fall on the land, the aspens going gold in the mountain draws they could see from the porch, the cattle fat from a good summer, the hay cut and stacked in quantities that would see them comfortably through even a hard winter. Clara stood at the edge of the south pasture on an October evening, 46 head of good cattle moving slowly in the last light, and she felt the full, clean weight of what had been built. Rafe came to stand beside her, coming from the round pen where he had been finishing the day's work with a young gelding belonging to a cavalry officer who had ridden out from the fort at Elko 3 days ago with a horse problem, and no idea how to solve it. He stood beside her at the fence and looked out at their land, and she felt his arm come around her shoulders in the easy, natural way it always did, as though it belonged there, which she had come to understand it did. "Do you remember," she said, "the first time you came to the porch?" "I remember every second of it," he said. "I thought you were going to shoot me." "I almost did," she said. "I know," he said. "Your hand was on that rifle the whole time. I was watching." She looked at him. "You could see me through the window." "Not until you opened the door," he said. "But then I could see you very clearly." She thought about that for a moment, thought about the woman in the doorway with the Winchester and the nightgown and the boots, angry and alone, and trying not to show either. She thought about what it had looked like from the other side, from the porch, from the eyes of a man who had been leaving lanterns in the dark for weeks. "Why," she said, "the same question I asked you the first night. Why did you keep leaving them when you did not know how I would respond?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the pasture. The sun was going down behind the mountains to the west, the sky going from orange to rose to the deep, clear blue that preceded Nevada stars. "Because your windows were dark every night," he said, "and I did not think they should be. That is all it was at first. I just did not think they should be." She leaned into his side and he pulled her a little closer, and they stood there as the light finished changing and the first stars appeared, and the cattle moved in the pasture, and the horses were quiet in the barn, and the cabin behind them had firelight in the windows, and inside it, Eddie was probably getting into mischief of some kind while Jamie slept through everything in the uncanny way he had always slept, profoundly and without concern for the world's opinions. "They are not dark anymore," she said. "No," he said, "they are not." She thought about the lanterns, all of them, the ones that were still on the shelf and the windowsill inside because she had never moved them, had never stopped keeping them. She lit them on evenings that felt significant, or on evenings that felt like they needed to be significant, and the light they made was warm and various as the people who had come to mean everything to her. The brass one with the etched glass, the star lantern with its punch-tin constellation, the green glass chimney that turned the light the color of the sea she had never seen but had read about. The evening deepened. Rafe said something about dinner, and she said she had left a pot on the stove and they should probably go in. And they turned from the fence and walked back across the yard to the cabin, his arm still around her, her hand finding his at her shoulder, and the land spread out around them in every direction, dark and enormous and full of stars, and the cabin windows glowed warm gold against it all. That night, after the children were asleep, she and Rafe sat at the kitchen table with the lanterns burning around them, drinking the last of the evening coffee, and they talked in the low, easy voices of people who have said everything important to each other at some point, and are content now to say the comfortable things. He was reading one of the books he had taken in trade that week. She was mending a split seam in Eddie's good shirt, and the fire in the stove popped quietly, and the wind pressed gently at the walls and found no weakness, because Rafe had chinked the gaps last month with fresh mortar. She looked up from her mending and looked at him, reading by the lantern light, his reading face, which was the absorbed, absent expression of a man who had traveled entirely out of the room and into the page. She had catalogued his expressions over 4 years as carefully and as fondly as she catalogued everything that mattered: the way he looked when a horse finally gave him its trust, the way he looked when Eddie said something unexpectedly insightful, the way he looked at her across a room when he thought she was not watching. He looked up and caught her watching and said, "What?" "Nothing," she said. "I was thinking about everything that would not have happened if you had not left that first lantern," she said. He considered this with the seriousness he brought to everything. "We would have gotten there some other way," he said. "I believe that." "Maybe," she said, "but I am glad it happened this way." He smiled at her, the full, unguarded smile she had worked to earn in the autumn of 1882 and which she still felt as something precious every time she saw it. "So am I," he said. She went back to her mending. He went back to his book. The lanterns burned steadily around them, the flames inside them steady and certain, and outside the Nevada night lay over the land in a profound, magnificent dark, and Clara Callister, who had once needed all the light she could get, and had since discovered that some of it she could make herself, and some of it arrived on her porch from the hands of a man who had noticed her windows were dark, and decided he would do something about it, sat in the warm cabin that had become entirely a home and was, in every possible way, content. In the spring of 1888, when the land was coming green again and the horses in the round pen were learning the patience that their trainer modeled, Clara discovered she was expecting a third time. She told Rafe on a Tuesday morning over breakfast, and he set down his coffee cup and said, "How are you feeling?" before he said anything else, which was exactly what she had come to expect of him, and which never stopped being the right thing. She was feeling fine, she said. She was feeling more than fine. The baby was a girl, born in November with a full head of dark hair, and a disposition that, from the very first days, combined her mother's intensity with her father's patience, in a mixture that seemed likely to be formidable once she was old enough to deploy it. They named her Me Edmund Callister, for the month that Tom Calloway said she was clearly intending to arrive in until she very much did not, and for her grandfather, and she came into the world just as winter was building itself at the edges of the mountains and the air had gone cold and clear, and the stars were at their most brilliant. Tom Calloway died in the winter of 1888, peacefully and in his bed, which was, the neighbors agreed, a good end for a man who deserved one. Rafe had ridden out to check on him when the old man had not been seen in 10 days, and had found him very peacefully still, as though the final sleep had simply followed on from all the others without any particular drama. They buried him near his own house as he had requested, under the aspen grove at the north end of his property, and Rafe said a few words that were good words, honest and warm and precisely the right length. Tom had left his property, which had no other claimants, to Clara, a fact revealed by the Elko County clerk in the new year when the relevant papers were sorted. It was 43 acres, modest but adjacent to their own land, and it more than doubled their usable pasture. Clara rode the boundary of it in February on the big gray mare, who was now her best riding horse and had proven every invested hour of Rafe's early patience. And she thought about Tom Calloway and his spotted mule and his careful, grandmotherly eyes and the way he had sat at her kitchen table and looked at the lanterns and said some men did not lead with words. She said thank you to the wind and the empty aspen grove, and then she rode home. The years began to layer themselves one on another in the way that good years do, distinct in their particulars but connected by a continuous warmth, a continuous rightness. Eddie grew into a boy of remarkable capability, and then into a young man of steady temperament who had his mother's eye for what needed doing and his father's hands for doing it. Jamie grew quieter and more watchful as he aged, in the way of a person who is absorbing the world slowly and completely, and he showed the first signs of his father's gift, with horses so early that Rafe began teaching him properly at 8 years old, working beside him in the round pen on quiet afternoons. Me, as she grew, proved to be exactly what her first days had suggested she would be: intense and patient and extraordinarily determined, a combination that her parents found alternately exhausting and deeply satisfying. She read everything she could get hold of, sending her father on trading missions to Elko's small lending library whenever travelers brought news of new stock. She asked questions that occasionally surprised even Clara, who had high standards for questions. In the evening, still, the lanterns burned. Not all of them at once, but the habit remained. One or two on the kitchen table, one on the windowsill, the etched brass lantern that Rafe had brought on Christmas 1882 in its permanent place on the shelf above the kitchen door. Clara lit them with the same ease with which she did all the necessary, sustaining things, and the light they made was as much a part of the cabin as the walls or the wood floor, or the particular way the stove draft creaked in cold weather. Rafe watched her light them sometimes in the evenings when he was not occupied with something else, and his expression was one she knew well, the quiet, complete happiness of a man who had been, against all his previous understanding of himself, successfully surprised by his own life. He had stayed, not as a hired man and not as a guest. He had stayed as the person he was, and the land had taken the shape of him as much as it had taken the shape of her. The round pen on the south side, the improvements to the barn, the second water trough, the fencing patterns that were his in the way of handwriting, recognizable in their particular economy. And she had taken the shape of him in return, not changed, because that was not what love did, but deepened, extended, the way a river in flood takes on a broader geography without ceasing to be the same river. On a warm evening in September of 1892, the 1st of October approaching, and a very slight bite to the air after dark that said the world was turning again toward winter, Clara and Rafe sat on the porch together in the old way, with the evening going down in orange and rose over the mountains, and the horses settled in the barn and the children in the house behind them. Eddie at 16 studying by lamplight, Jamie at 13 in all likelihood asleep already. Me at 9 sitting on the kitchen floor reading a book as large as her torso with a concentration that Clara had already checked on twice. 10 years, Rafe said. She glanced at him. Nearly, she said. October 3rd, he nodded. He had remembered before she had, which was not always the way but which pleased her. 10 years since the first lantern, she said. He was quiet a moment. The evening moved around them, the last insects making their small sounds in the dry grass of the yard, the horses shifting in the barn, the wide Nevada dark coming down at the horizon in the east and the last of the color holding in the west. "Do you regret anything?" he said. She considered the question because it deserved consideration. She thought about every year of it, every difficulty and every good thing, the water rights and the births and the deaths, and the fence that needed mending every spring on the south side where the soil was soft, and the letters in the winter of 1882 that she still had in the cedar box under the bed, and the book of verse she had given him in Morrison's barn, and that still lived on the shelf above his side of the bed, read many times and showing it. She thought about Eddie and Jamie and me, and about Tom Calloway buried under his aspens, and about her father under the juniper tree on the east edge of the land, both of them somehow present in the quality of what had been built here. "Not one thing," she said. He took her hand there on the porch in the last of the September light, and she laced her fingers through his and felt the familiar roughness of his palm and the particular fit of his hand around hers, 10 years of it, and still as certain as the first time in a barn in December. "Not one thing," he said, echoing her. They sat until the stars came out, all of them, the whole extravagant Nevada sky, and the mountains went dark, and the cabin behind them glowed with the light of the lanterns in the windows, warm and steady and permanent as anything she had ever known. Inside, on the kitchen table, the lanterns burned. They had always burned. They would go on burning. The dark windows that had once told a quiet, careful man something was missing were not dark anymore, had not been dark for 10 years, would not be dark again. And across the table from the empty chair where loneliness had once sat, There was a man who had ridden out of the Nevada night with a lantern and no explanation, and who had, in the end, explained everything. Clara Callister looked at the stars and felt the hand of her husband in hers, and listened to the quiet sounds of her full, abundant home. And she was, as she had been every evening for a decade when she stopped to let herself know it, entirely and without reservation glad. The October air came down off the mountains and moved across the porch, and she pulled their joined hands up and held them against her chest, over the warm, steady, uncomplicated beating of her heart. He turned and looked at her in the dark. She looked back. No lantern needed.